The whole village feared the old, thick forest. But for me, that forest was the only refuge I had ever known. I did not know that the wounded wolf I tended every single day was no ordinary animal. He was the king lost for centuries, the one whose return the whole world had been waiting for. They called it the Duskwood, and they said the dark in it was older than the village, older than the stone chapel with its leaning bell, older than the names carved into the churchyard. The elders had a rule they repeated the way other people said their prayers. Never go past the split oak after dusk. Never follow a sound you cannot name. And never ever look a wolf in the eye, because a wolf in the duskwood will hold your gaze the way a person does. And that is how you know it is not truly a wolf at all. I was the only soul in Hollowbrook who did not fear it. My name is Elowen, and I had good reason to prefer the trees to the townsfolk. My mother died when I was 9, of a winter fever that took half the lane with her, and my father followed her 3 springs later, not of any fever but of grief that hollowed him from the inside until there was nothing left to hold him up. After that I lived at the edge of the village in the cottage they left me, mending nets and gathering herbs and keeping to myself. And the good people of Hollowbrook decided among themselves that a girl who lived alone at the forest's edge and spoke to no one must be strange, and a girl who was strange must be watched, and a girl who was watched must never quite be let in. So I stopped waiting to be let in. I went instead to the Duskwood, where nothing watched me except the birds, and nothing judged me except my own heart, and the silence did not feel like a door closing but like a hand opening. I knew the paths the way I knew my own fingers. I knew where the wild thyme grew thick along the stream, and where the mushrooms clustered under the fallen ash, and where the light came down in the late afternoon in long gold bars that made the whole forest look like the inside of a cathedral. The village called it a place of death. To me, it was the only place I felt entirely, safely alive. Which is how I came to find him. It was late autumn, the year I turned 23, and the frost had already begun to silver the ferns in the mornings. I had gone deeper than usual, chasing a stand of elderberries I'd spotted the week before, when I heard it. A sound I could not name, low and broken, coming from the hollow beneath the split oak that the elders had warned me of my whole life. Every rule I had ever been taught told me to turn around. I went forward instead. He was lying in the leaf litter at the bottom of the hollow, and at first I thought he was already dead. He was enormous, larger than any wolf had a right to be, the size of a small pony, with a coat the deep gray of a storm sky and a white blaze down his chest like spilled milk. One of his hind legs was caught in the rusted iron teeth of a poacher's trap, and the ground around it was dark and wet, and his flank rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths that told me he had been there a long time. A day. Perhaps 2. I should have been afraid. Any sensible girl would have been afraid. But I have never in my life been able to look at a wounded thing and think of my own safety first, and so I did the foolish, tender thing that would change the whole course of my small life. I knelt down beside a dying wolf in the forbidden dark of the Duskwood, and I spoke to him softly, the way you'd speak to a frightened child. "Easy now," I whispered. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you." He opened his eyes. And that was the first time the old warning came true for me, because his eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were a pale, luminous gold, and when they found mine, they held, not with the flat, glassy fear of a trapped beast, but with something aware, something that saw me, something that understood, with a depth that made the breath catch in my throat, that I had chosen to help rather than to run. We stayed like that for a long moment, the girl and the wolf, looking at each other in the failing light. And then, very slowly, he let his great head sink back down into the leaves, and he closed his eyes, and he gave himself over into my keeping. It took me the better part of an hour to free him. The trap was old and stiff, and I had to pry the jaws apart with a fallen branch, sweating in the cold, terrified the whole time that the pain would send him lunging for my throat. but he did not so much as growl. He lay still as stone and let me work, and when at last the iron sprang loose and I eased his mangled leg free, he only let out a long, shuddering breath, as though he had been holding it for 2 days. I could not carry him. He was far too large for that. But I could not leave him either, not with the night coming down and the cold coming with it. So I did what I could. I cleaned the wound with water from the stream and bound it with strips torn from my own underskirt, and I gathered him a bed of dry bracken, and I built a small ring of stones and coaxed a fire to life within it, and I sat with him through the whole of that long black night, my hand resting lightly on the storm-gray fur of his shoulder, so that he would know, even in his sleep, that he was not alone. When the gray light of morning came, he was still breathing. I came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. I told myself at first that I was only being practical. A wound like that would fester if it wasn't tended. It needed cleaning, dressing, watching. I told myself I would stop coming once he could stand on his own. But the truth I did not want to look at directly, the way you don't look at the sun, was that, for the first time since my father died, I had a reason to wake up in the morning. I had somewhere to be. I had someone who was waiting for me. Because he was waiting, I was sure of it. Each afternoon when I came down into the hollow with my basket of clean bandages and bread, and whatever I had managed to spare from my own table, I would find him with his ears already pricked, his golden eyes already turned toward the path, as though he had heard me coming from a mile off, which, I would later learn, he had. And when he saw me, something in the great gray body would ease, would settle, and he would thump his tail once against the leaves in a way that was so absurdly, achingly like a dog greeting its person that it made my chest hurt. I named him Ash, for the storm color of his coat and for the tree he had lain beneath. He was the strangest animal I had ever known. He would not eat the raw meat I brought until I had turned my back, as though ashamed to be seen doing something so bestial. He watched my hands when I worked, and my face when I spoke, and I swear to you he understood every word, not the words themselves, perhaps, but the shape of them, the meaning underneath. When I was sad, he pressed his heavy head into my lap and stayed there until the sadness passed. When I laughed, his ears would lift and his tail would beat, as though my happiness were a thing he had been starving for. And his eyes, I could never get used to his eyes. There was a person in them, I know how that sounds. But I sat with him through 100 afternoons in that green and gold hollow, and I came to know the difference between the look of a beast and the look of a soul, and Ash had a soul. It was a grieving one. Sometimes, in the quiet, he would turn those golden eyes up to the canopy and hold them there, unmoving, for a long time, and the loss in them was so vast and so old that I would have to look away, because it was too much like looking into a well with no bottom. "What happened to you?" I asked him once quietly, my fingers buried in the ruff of his neck. "Where did you come from? Who are you really?" He turned and looked at me, and for one dizzying moment I felt he was about to answer, actually about to answer. And then the moment passed, and he only sighed and laid his head against my knee, and we sat together in the falling dark and did not speak, because between us, by then, we did not always need to. The seasons turned. His leg healed, knit crooked at first, then straighter, then whole. He grew strong again, strong enough to run, and I knew, with a grief I could not admit even to myself, that the day was coming when he would not need me any more. But he never left. Winter came, and I brought him a blanket, and he lay against my legs through the coldest nights while the fire burned low. Spring came, and he walked beside me through the waking forest, matching his great loping stride to my small one. Summer came, and I found I could no longer imagine a single day of my life that did not have him in it. 2 years passed this way. 2 years of tending a wounded guardian in the forbidden dark, 2 years of the only companionship I had ever truly trusted, and never once in all that time did I imagine he could be anything other than what he seemed. I was a fool, but I was a happy one, and happiness, I have learned, is worth being a fool for. Everything changed on the night the strangers came. It was midsummer, and I had lingered in the hollow later than I ever had before, because Ash had been restless all week, pacing, listening, lifting his nose to sense on the wind that I could not smell. His golden eyes turned again and again toward the deep north of the forest where I had never gone. Something was coming. I could feel it in him the way you feel a storm before you see it, in the pricking of the skin and the stillness of the birds. That night, as the last light drained from the sky, he suddenly went rigid beside me. Every hair on his body rose. A sound came out of him that I had never heard in 2 years, a low, rolling growl that I felt in the ground beneath us, that raised the hair on my own arms. "Ash," I breathed, "what is it?" He stepped in front of me, deliberately, placing his great body between mine and the darkness of the northern trees, and I understood, in a rush of cold, that whatever was coming, he meant to stand between it and me. They came out of the dark like something from an old, terrible story. Wolves, but not wolves. Enormous like Ash, larger, some of them, with coats of black and silver and rust, moving with a coordination and an intelligence that no ordinary pack has ever possessed. There were 7 of them. They fanned out around the edge of the hollow in perfect silence, their eyes catching the firelight and throwing it back in points of green and gold, and they did not attack. They bowed. Every one of them lowered its head and its forequarters to the ground, in the direction of the storm-gray wolf standing guard over a trembling village girl, and they held the bow, and the whole forest seemed to hold its breath with them. And then the largest of them, a great black beast with a scar across its muzzle, lifted its head, and it spoke. Not in words, but in a voice all the same, a voice that arrived not in my ears but somewhere behind them, in the deep and secret part of the mind where dreams are made. "My king," it said, "we have searched for you for 100 years. We had begun to believe you lost forever, and we find you here bound to a human, hiding in the trees when your throne stands empty and your people cry out for their sovereign." I could not move. I could not breathe. I stood frozen at the edge of the firelight while my whole understanding of the world came apart at the seams. And Ash, my wounded, gentle, grieving Ash, turned to look at me, and in his golden eyes I saw grief and apology and something that broke my heart clean in two, because it was goodbye. And then he changed. I have tried in all the years since to find words for what I saw that night, and I have never quite managed it. It was not violent. It was not grotesque, the way the old stories make it sound. It was more like watching frost melt from a window, a shimmer, a shifting of light, a folding of one shape into another as naturally as water finding its level. The storm-gray fur drew inward. The great body rose up. And where a wolf had stood, there was a man. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair falling past a strong and weary face, and eyes, the same impossible pale gold set now in a human face that was, God help me, the most striking I had ever seen. He was dressed in nothing but the plain, dark clothes that seemed to arrive with the changing, as though the magic had a modesty of its own, and he stood there in the firelight, this stranger who was not a stranger, and he looked at me with 2 years of my whole heart in his eyes. "Eloin," he said, and his voice, his actual voice, deep and low and roughened by 100 years of silence, was the voice I had somehow always known was underneath the growl. "Eloin, I am so sorry. I never meant for you to learn it like this. I should have run. Any sensible girl would have run. I stayed. Of course I stayed. I have never once in my life been able to run from a thing that needed me, and even then, even in that impossible moment with the whole world upside down, I could see it plain as day. This was still him. This was still Ash. The grief in those golden eyes was the same grief I had held in my lap through 100 quiet afternoons. "You could speak," I said. "It was all I could manage. All this time you could speak and you never." "I could not." He took a step toward me, and the 7 wolves at the edge of the firelight went very still, watching. Not in that shape, The change was taken from me, stolen, 100 years past, by the one who wanted my throne. He bound me into the body of a beast and cast me out to die in the wild lands, and for a century I wandered alone, more animal than man with each passing year, feeling my own self slipping away from me a little more with every winter. His jaw tightened. I was so close to losing it entirely, to forgetting I had ever been a man at all. And then a poacher's trap caught me in the duskwood, and I lay down to die, and I had made my peace with it. He looked at me, and the gold of his eyes went soft. And then a girl came down into the hollow, he said quietly, who was not afraid, who knelt beside a dying wolf and told him she would not hurt him, and she came back the next day, and the day after that. His voice roughened. Elowen, you did not only heal my leg. You held the man inside the beast together when he was coming apart. Every kindness you showed me, every word, every hour you sat with me in the dark, you were reminding me, without ever knowing it, that I had once been something worth speaking to. You kept my soul alive when I had all but given it up for lost. I do not know who I would be now if you had walked past that hollow. I do not think there would have been anyone left inside to save. The fire crackled. The wolves watched, and I stood at the edge of the only refuge I had ever known, and I understood, all at once and far too late, why my heart had hurt every time I imagined a day without him in it. His name, I learned, was Ronan. Ronan of the Silver Pine, last true king of the Wolfkin, whose bloodline had held the northern packs together for 1,000 years before a treacherous cousin named Vareth had torn it all apart. The great black wolf with the scarred muzzle changed, too, into a broad and battle-worn man who knelt before Ronan on one knee and would not rise, and whose name was Bran, and who had been Ronan's sworn shield brother before the fall, and who had never once in 100 years stopped searching. One by one the others changed, and knelt, and I stood in a clearing full of kneeling warriors while my own knees threatened to give out beneath me. My lord, Bran said, and his weathered face was wet. Vareth's grip on the pax weakens. He is old now and cruel, and the people despise him. If their true king were to return, if you were to stand before them, whole and yourself again, they would rise for you in a single night. But we must go now, my lord. Tonight, before Vareth learns you live. Ronan turned to me, and I watched the terrible war go on behind his golden eyes, the king who owed everything to his people, and the man who owed something else, something newer and more fragile, to a girl in a torn underskirt at the edge of a firelight. Go, I said. My voice did not shake, which surprised me. Ronan, go. Your people have waited 100 years. Elowen. Go. The word came out of me like a stone I had to force from my own chest. It's who you are. I've always known you were more than you seemed. I've known it since the first night when you looked at me and I saw a person looking back. I made myself smile, though it cost me everything I had. I would never forgive myself if I kept a king from his throne. Go and be who you were born to be. He crossed the clearing to me then, this king, this man, and he took my 2 hands in his. The first time I had ever felt his hands as hands, warm and calloused and real, and he pressed them against his chest over his heart, where the white blaze had been. You do not understand, he said, very low so that only I could hear. I am not asking you to let me go, Elowen. I am asking you to come with me. The forest tilted around me. You are mad, I whispered. I'm a village girl, I mend nets. I have nothing, no name, no house that wouldn't fit inside your smallest room, no. You have, he said, the truest heart I have encountered in a century of walking this earth. Do you imagine that is a small thing? I have known kings and generals and high-born ladies dripping with jewels, and not one of them ever knelt in the dark to save a dying stranger who could give them nothing in return. His hands tightened around mine. My people do not follow strength, Elowen. Any brute can be strong. Vareth is strong. My people follow those who are worthy. And I have never in my life met anyone more worthy than the girl who was not afraid. I looked up into his golden eyes, the eyes I had loved as a wolf's and would come to love, I already knew, as a man's. and I felt the last of my objections crumble, because underneath all of them was one simple truth I could no longer hide from. I did not want to live a single day of my life without him in it. I never had. "You will regret it," I said, one last weak attempt at sense. "A king and a net mender, they'll never accept me." "Then they will answer to me," he said, and there was iron in it, the iron of 1,000 years of kings. And then softer, "But you are wrong, Elowen. They will love you because I do." The whole clearing went still. I had not known, how could I have known? That among the Wolfkin, the words were not spoken lightly. That a king did not say them to a village girl in front of his sworn warriors unless he meant them all the way down to the marrow. Bran drew a sharp breath. The others exchanged glances I did not yet know how to read. But I understood the important part. I understood that the man who had been my wounded guardian for 2 long years, whom I had tended without ever knowing who he was standing in the firelight of the only home I had ever known and telling me, plainly and without shame, that he had chosen me. "Come with me," Ronan said again, and this time it was not a command. It was the softest and most frightened thing I ever heard him say in all the years that followed. "Please." And I, the strange girl, the outcast, the fool who could never look away from a wounded thing, did the tender, foolish, life-changing thing one more time. I said yes. We traveled north for 6 days, deeper into country than I had ever dreamed of, and with every mile the Duskwood I had known fell further behind, and a stranger, wilder land rose up to meet us. Mountains like the broken teeth of the earth. Forests so ancient the trees had grown together overhead into a green roof that shut out the sky. And everywhere, as word spread of who traveled among us, the Wolfkin came. They came out of the trees in 2s and 3s at first, then in dozens, then in whole packs, drawn by some sense I did not possess, the knowledge, carried on the wind and in the blood, that their lost king had returned. They came in wolf shape and knelt, and they came in the shapes of men and women and knelt, and some of them wept openly to see him, these hard and weathered people of the north, because they had lived their whole lives under Vareth's cruelty, and had never truly believed the old stories that a better king would come again. And they looked at me. I will not pretend it was easy. It was not. I saw the confusion in their faces, the question they were too well-mannered or too afraid to ask aloud. Who is this human? Why does the king keep her at his side and look at her the way he does? I heard the murmurs that stopped when I drew near. I was a small and plain thing in a borrowed cloak, walking among a proud and ancient people, and I felt every inch of the distance between what I was and what they expected their king to want. But Ronan never once let the distance stand. He walked beside me, not ahead of me. When we stopped, it was my needs he saw to first. When his people knelt, he raised them up and he presented me. "This is Elowen, who saved my life and my soul both," and he said it in a voice that dared any one of them to think less of me. And slowly, mile by mile and day by day, I watched the confusion in their faces turn to curiosity, and the curiosity turned to warmth as they came to see what he had seen. That I did not treat them as beasts or as legends, but as people. That I asked their names and remembered them. That when an old she-wolf's grandchild fell ill on the road, it was the village net mender who knew which herbs would break the fever, and who sat up through the night to tend the little one just as she had once tended a dying wolf in a hollow. By the time we reached the foot of the great mountain where Vareth's stolen hall stood, they had stopped calling me the human. They had begun to call me my lady. I will tell you now, honestly, that I was afraid of what was coming. Bran spoke of Vareth in low tones around the fire at night, of 100 years of cruelty, of a king who ruled through fear and had not a single friend in all the north, only servants too frightened to defy him. He would not give up the throne he had murdered his way onto. There would be a reckoning, and I was terrified in the deepest part of me that having found Ronan, having finally understood my own heart, I would lose him to a war before we ever had the chance to see what we might become. On the last night before we reached the mountain, I could not sleep. I rose from my place by the fire and walked a little way apart, to a shelf of stone that looked out over the moon-silvered forest, and I stood there wrapped in my cloak and let the fear have me for a while, because it seemed better to face it alone than to carry it into the morning. I did not hear him approach. He was still when he wished to be, as silent as the wolf he had been. "You are frightened," Ronan said quietly, coming to stand beside me at the edge of the stone. "For you," I admitted. There seemed no use in pretending otherwise. "Bran says Vareth will not step down, that there will be blood." "There may be. He did not lie to me, he never did. But there is more of my blood in these mountains than there is of his, Alowan. The packs will rise. I do not go into this hall alone." He was quiet a moment. "But that is not the whole of what frightens you, is it?" I looked out over the silver trees and found I could not answer him. "Say it," he said gently. "I am afraid," I whispered, "that I have let myself love a thing I was always going to lose." The words came out ragged. "I lost my mother. I lost my father. I have spent my whole life at the edge of things, never let all the way in, and I told myself I did not mind, that the forest was enough, that I did not need to be anyone's, and then you looked at me with a wolf's eyes and undid the whole of it, and now the thought of a world without you in it," my voice broke. "I do not think I could bear it twice, Ronan. To find the one place I belong, and then to have it taken." For a long moment he said nothing. And then he turned me gently to face him, and in the moonlight his golden eyes were the eyes I had loved through 2 years of quiet dark, and he said the thing I have carried in my heart every day of my life since. "Alowan, among my people there is a bond that is deeper than choice, deeper than love even, though love grows from it like a tree from a root. We call it the mate bond, and it comes once if it comes at all, and when it does, it is not a thing that can be broken by distance or by death or by any power under the sky." He lifted one hand and laid it very lightly against the side of my face. "I did not tell you before because I did not want you to feel bound to me by something you did not choose. I wanted you to come north because you wished to, not because the blood in you gave you no choice. But you should know the truth of it now, on the eve of what comes tomorrow." He looked at me as though I were the only thing in the whole moonlit world. "The night you knelt beside me in that hollow," he said, "I knew. In the first moment our eyes met, before you had spoken a word, the wolf in me knew what the man had almost forgotten how to feel. There she is. There is mine. 100 years of wandering, and I found you at the very bottom of my life in the dark, with a poacher's iron in my leg, and even then, even half a beast and more than half dead, my soul turned to yours like a flower to the sun and said, 'At last.'" His thumb brushed the tear from my cheek. "You have not let yourself love a thing you were always going to lose, Alowan. You have found the one thing in all the world that you cannot lose. I am yours. I was yours before either of us understood it. And whatever comes tomorrow, that will not change, because it is not the kind of thing that changes. It is the kind of thing the whole world is built on." I stood on the shelf of stone with the moon on the forest below, and the fear did not leave me entirely. It never entirely does, but it stopped being the only thing I could feel. Because underneath it now there was something older and stronger, something that had been growing quietly in me for 2 years without my ever giving it a name. "I love you," I said. It was the first time I had said it aloud. It felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. "Ronan, whoever you are, king or wolf or wounded stranger in the dark, I love you. I think I have for longer than I knew." And the king of the Silver Pine, last of his ancient line, bent his head and rested his brow against mine there in the silver dark, and for a little while neither of us said anything at all, because we did not need to. We never had. Morning came gray and cold over the mountain, and with it came the war. Vareth Stolen Hall was not a castle in the way the old picture books drew them, with white towers and bright banners. It was older and darker than that, a great hall of black stone raised into the very face of the mountain. its roof lost in the low cloud, its walls slick with 100 years of mountain damp. It looked less like a home than like a wound in the rock. And standing before it, when we came up out of the tree line in the thin dawn light, was a host. I had not known there were so many wolfkin in all the world. They filled the great stone shelf before the hall, hundreds of them, in wolf shape and in the shapes of men and women, and for a moment my heart failed me because I thought they were Vareths, and I thought we were lost before we had even begun. Then Bran, walking at Ronan's right hand, began to laugh, a low, rough, wondering laugh. The laugh of a man who has waited 100 years for a thing and cannot quite believe it has come. "They came," he said. "My lord, they came." And I understood. They were not Vareth's host, they were ours. Word had run ahead of us on the wind and in the blood, faster than any messenger. The true king has returned, the lost one, the last of the Silver Pine, and the Packs of the North, who had endured a century of a cruel usurper because they had no one to rise for, had come down out of their forests and their hidden valleys to stand for the king who had come home at last. They knelt when they saw him, all of them in one great silent wave, like grass going down before the wind. Hundreds of proud and ancient people, kneeling in the cold dawn to a man in plain dark clothes who had spent 100 years as a beast in the wild. And Ronan stopped. I watched him look out over them, over his people, his true people, whom he had believed lost to him forever, and I saw his throat work, and I saw the shine come into his golden eyes, and for a moment the king was gone and there was only a man who had come home. He did not speak at first. He only stood and let them see him, and let himself see them, and the cold wind moved over the mountain and stirred the gray grass and no one made a sound. Then he lifted his voice, and it rolled out over the shelf of stone like thunder over the sea. "Rise," he said, "my people, my kin. You have knelt long enough, 100 years too long, to one who never deserved it. Rise, and let no one of the Silver Pine ever kneel to a false king again." They rose, and the sound they made as they rose, a great low roar, half words and half the wild voice of the wolf, rising up the black face of the mountain, was the sound of 100 years of grief and fear breaking apart all at once. The doors of the black hall opened. Vareth came out alone. I do not know what I had expected, some towering monster perhaps, some beast out of the Elder's warnings. What came out of the hall was an old man, tall still and broad still, with the same wild strength in the shoulders that all his kind seemed to carry, but old, his hair gone the color of iron and ash, his face seamed and hard, his pale eyes sunk deep. He wore black, and about his shoulders was a cloak of gray wolf fur that I understood, with a cold turn of the stomach, had not been given willingly. He looked out over the vast host that had come to unseat him, and he did not flinch. Whatever else he was not a coward. "So," he said, his voice was dry as old leaves, "the whelp lives, 100 years and the whelp lives." His sunken eyes found Ronan across the gray stone. "I should have torn your throat out when I had you, cousin, instead of leaving it to the wild lands to do my work. Sentiment. It was always my one weakness." "You have a great many weaknesses, Vareth," Ronan said. "Sentiment was never among them." A murmur ran through the host, grim and pleased. Vareth's lip curled. "You come with an army at your back and you think that makes you king. It does not. Any brute can gather a mob. The throne of the Silver Pine is not won by numbers." His eyes glittered. "It is won the old way, blood to blood, you against me, unless 100 years of running about on 4 legs has made you forget how it is done." And there it was, the reckoning Bran had warned me of, laid out plain in the cold morning light. I felt my heart clench in my chest. I looked at Ronan, my Ronan, who had lain wounded in my lap, who had held the man inside the beast together only because I had come down into a hollow, and I wanted to cry out, to tell him not to tell him no throne was worth it. But I did not, because I understood, even in my fear, what Vareth was doing. He could not win by numbers. The whole North had turned against him. So he was staking everything on the one old law that could still take it all away, single combat, blood to blood, because a beaten Vareth might still be a live one, and a king who refused the challenge would be no king at all in the eyes of his people. It was a cruel and clever trap, and there was no way through it but forward. Ronan looked at me. Across all that gray stone, across the hundreds of watching wolfkin, he looked at me, and his golden eyes asked me a question, and I understood that too. He was asking me whether I could bear it. Whether, having only just found him, I could stand to watch him walk into a fight that might take him from me. I lifted my chin, and I gave him the only answer I could give the man I loved. I nodded. Go, I told him without a word, the way we had always spoken. Be who you were born to be. I will be here when it is done. Something eased in his eyes, and he turned to face his cousin, and he shed the plain, dark clothes of a man, and between one breath and the next the storm-gray wolf I had loved for 2 years stood in his place, larger than I had ever seen him, whole and healed and terrible, the white blaze bright on his chest, his golden eyes burning. Vareth changed too, into a great beast the color of old iron, heavier than Ronan and thick with 100 years of cruel strength. And they came together on the gray stone, with a sound like the mountain itself splitting. I cannot tell you the whole of that fight, because for much of it I could not watch. I have never been able to look at a wounded thing without wanting to run to it, and here was the thing I loved best in all the world, tearing and being torn, and every instinct in me screamed to go to him, and every scrap of sense I had left held me back, because to break that circle was to shame him before his people, and to break the old law that alone could make his victory whole. So I stood, with Bran's steadying hand on my shoulder, and I watched what I could bear to watch. They were well matched at the first. Vareth was heavier, and 100 years of ruling had not made him soft. He fought with a vicious, economical cruelty, wasting nothing, going always for the throat, the belly, the tendon. Twice he opened Ronan's gray hide, and twice the blood ran bright on the stone, and each time I felt it in my own body like a blow, and each time Bran's hand tightened on my shoulder and held me where I stood. But Vareth had one weakness after all, and it was the oldest one of any king who rules through fear. He had never in 100 years fought for anything but himself. He fought to keep a throne. He fought to keep a life bought with murder, and a thing fought for out of greed can never quite match a thing fought for out of love. Because Ronan was not fighting for the throne. I saw it in the terrible middle of it, when the tide began to turn. I saw that every time Vareth's teeth found him, Ronan's golden eyes turned, not away, not down in defeat, but to me across the gray stone, for the half-instant it took to remember why he could not fall. And I understood that I was in the fight too, though I never moved from where I stood. That the girl who had held the man inside the beast together in a quiet hollow was holding him together still, here on the Black Mountain, with nothing but the fact of her, waiting, at the edge of the circle. Vareth fought to keep, Ronan fought to come home. It was not close, in the end. When the old iron wolf finally overreached, lunging for the killing bite with all the weight of his 100 cruel years behind it, Ronan was not there. He turned, quick as water, the way I had watched him turn 1,000 times through the summer forest, and he took his cousin by the throat, and he bore him down onto the gray stone, and he held him there. The whole mountain went silent. Vareth lay pinned beneath the jaws of the king he had tried to murder 100 years before, his old body heaving, his life a single closing of teeth away. And Ronan held him and did not close them. I understood later that everyone expected him to, that the old law said he might, that 100 years of Vareth's cruelty had earned it 100 times over, that not one soul on that mountain would have spoken a word against it. The usurper was beaten. The throne was won. All that remained was the ending of it. And Ronan let him go. He stepped back off his cousin's throat, and between one breath and the next he stood a man again, tall and bleeding and terrible in the gray dawn, and he looked down at the broken old thing gasping on the stone at his feet. "No," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of that silent host. "100 years ago you cast me out to die a beast in the dark, cousin, because you believed that power is the only thing that is real, and that mercy is a weakness to be exploited. And you were nearly right. I nearly became the thing you tried to make me, a beast with no man left inside it, believing in nothing but tooth and claw." His golden eyes lifted and found me across all that stone. But I was saved by someone who knelt beside a dying stranger in the dark and showed him a mercy he could give her nothing for. And so I have learned a thing you never will, in all your 100 cruel years. Mercy is not the weakness of a king, Vareth. It is the whole of what makes him worth following. He turned from his cousin, as though the old man were already nothing. "Take him beyond the borders of the north," he said to Bran. "Let him live out what years he has left in the wild lands he sent me to. Let him learn, if he can, what 100 years alone in the dark will teach a man about the value of a kind hand." He looked once more at the old wolf on the stone, and there was no hatred in his face, only a great and final weariness. "It is more than you gave me. It is more than you deserve. But I am done letting you decide what kind of king I am." And that was the end of Vareth. Not with blood and a body on the stone, and a throne bought a second time in murder, but with mercy, before the whole watching north. They carried the old usurper away into the wild lands, and I do not know what became of him, and I have found over all the years since that I do not need to. Because the point of it was never Vareth at all. The point of it was the kind of king who came home to the Silverpine that morning. They crowned him at the turning of the season, when the first snows came down soft on the Black Mountain and made it, for a little while, almost beautiful. I will not pretend I was easy about my place in it. Even then, even after the road north, even after the mountain, even after the whole host had seen their king let his enemy live for the sake of a mercy I had taught him without meaning to, there was a part of me that stood at the edge of that ancient hall in a gown finer than anything I had ever touched and thought, "I do not belong here. I am a net mender. I gather herbs. My whole house would fit inside the smallest room of this place, and any moment now they will all remember it and look at me and know." Ronan found me there at the edge of things, the way he always did. "You are hiding," he said. He had healed clean from the fight, though he would carry the scars of it always, a pale seam through one dark brow, a stiffness in the shoulder on cold mornings. He wore the gray of the Silverpine now, and a circlet of dark iron, and he looked every inch the king the old stories had promised. And yet when he looked at me it was still, always, only ash, the wounded thing in the hollow, the golden eyes that had held mine and not let go. "I am not hiding," I said. "I am considering the room." "You are hiding." He came and stood beside me, not in front the way he always did, so that we looked out at the great hall together. "Tell me what frightens you now, Eloin. Vareth is gone. The north is yours." "That is exactly what frightens me." The words came out smaller than I meant them to. "It is yours, Ronan. The north, the throne, the whole of it, it belongs to you. It is written in your blood 1,000 years deep." But me, I looked down at the fine gray gown, at hands that still had the calluses of the nets in them, that always would. I do not know how to be a queen. I do not know how to be anything but the strange girl at the edge of the forest that nobody wanted. What happens when your people look at me one morning and see her? When they ask you why the king of the Silverpine bound himself to a human who mends nets? For a long moment, Ronan said nothing. And then he took my calloused hand in his scarred one, and he turned it over, and he pressed his lips to the palm, to the hard places the ropes had made, the marks of every net I had ever mended in that cottage at the edge of Hollowbrook. And when he lifted his head, his golden eyes were bright. "Then I will tell them the truth," he said, "that I have known kings and generals and high-born ladies dripping with jewels, and not one of them ever knelt in the dark to save a dying stranger who could give them nothing. That the whole of what I am, the mercy that spared Vareth, the man who came home to them instead of the beast that so nearly did not, The whole of it was held together by a village girl's kind hand through 2 years of quiet dark. That there is no throne in the north, Eloan, and no crown, and no ancient blood, that is worth half so much as the truest heart I have found in 100 years of walking this earth. He closed her fingers gently over the palm he had kissed. My people do not follow blood. They followed me up this mountain against 100 years of fear, and they did it because they saw a king who was worthy of it. And when they look at you, that is what they see too. The one who made me worth following. Do you imagine they will love you less for the calluses? They will love you more. Because you are the only queen the silver pine will ever have who knows, in her own 2 hands, what honest work is. I looked up at him. This king, this man, this wounded stranger from the dark who had somehow become the whole of my heart. And I felt the last of the old fear, the one I had carried since I was a girl of 9 standing at my mother's grave, come quietly loose in my chest. You will never let me stand at the edge of anything again, I said. Will you? No, he said. And he smiled, the smile I had watched 100 times in the shape of a thumping tail, come home at last to a human face. I have spent 100 years at the edge of everything, Eloan. I know what it is worth, and I will not have it for you, not for a single day more. He led me out of the shadow at the edge of the hall then, into the light, before all his gathered people, before Bran, weeping and unashamed, before the she-wolf whose grandchild I had nursed on the road, before the hundreds who had come down out of the forests to stand for their lost king. And he did not present me as a village girl he had chosen despite everything. He presented me as the reason there was a king at all to crown. This is Eloan, he said, and his voice filled the black hall to its lost and cloud-hidden roof. Who found your king half dead and more than half beast in a poacher's trap, and who healed not only his body but the man inside him that 100 years of the dark had all but stolen. There is not one of you here today who would have a king to kneel to, if not for the mercy of her hands. She is no stranger to the silver pine. She is its heart, and she will be your queen. And the great host of the north, proud, ancient, 100 years hardened, did the thing I had never once let myself imagine in all my life at the edge of things. They knelt to me, not because a king commanded it. I saw their faces as they went down, and there was no fear in them, the way there must have been for 100 years under Vareth. There was warmth. There was the she-wolf whose grandchild lived because of me. There was Bran, who had searched 100 years for his king and had watched me hand that king back his own soul without ever knowing I was doing it. There was a whole people, kneeling to the strange girl from the edge of the forest, not because they had to, but because they wished to. I did not run. For the first time in my whole life, standing before a thing far too large for me, I did not want to. I only reached out, and took my king's scarred hand in my calloused one, and held on.